All right, this is the fourth and last of these lectures. Thank you for coming. And after today's lecture, we will have just open the floor for any questions you have, any discussion you want to have. Doing it this way, it does at least, I think, may have spared me from having to say over and over again. Well, I was going to get to that in my third lecture. After the first one last week, Deirdre Sargentson told me about a passage in Karen Blixen's Out of Africa, which kind of took the top of my head off under the circumstances. And I tracked it down, and it is indeed as she said it was. I think, and I instantly realized it had to be here in this lecture. So we will start with this. It's not very long, and you will see its relevance in maybe 5 minutes. It's a brief anecdote called The Parrot. An old Danish ship owner sat and thought of his young days and of how he had, when he was 16 years old, spent a night in a brothel in Singapore. He had come in there with the sailors of his father's ship and had sat and talked with an old Chinese woman. When she heard that he was a native of a distant country, she brought out an old parrot that belonged to her. Long, long ago, she told him, the parrot had been given her by a high-born English lover of her youth. The boy thought that the bird must then be 100 years old, and parrots can do that. It could say various sentences in the languages of all the world picked up in the cosmopolitan atmosphere of the house. But one phrase the old China woman's lover had taught it before he sent it to her, and that she did not understand. Neither had any visitor ever been able to tell her what it meant. So now, for many years, she had given up asking. But if the boy came from far away, perhaps it was his language, and he could interpret the phrase to her. The boy had been deeply, strangely moved at the suggestion. When he looked at the parrot and thought that he might hear Danish from that terrible beak, he very nearly ran out of the house. But he stayed on only to do the old Chinese woman a service. But when she made the parrot speak its sentence, it turned out to be classic Greek. The bird spoke its words very slowly, and the boy knew enough Greek to recognize it. It was a verse from Sappho. The moon has sunk, and the Pleiades, and midnight is gone, and the hours are passing, and I lie alone. The old woman, when he translated the lines to her, smacked her lips and rolled her small, slanting eyes. She asked him to say it again and nodded her head. Today, I will be exiting one of my announced agendas, the fortunes of Sappho's surviving corpus in the 16th century. I'm by no means done with that topic to my satisfaction, but I have for the moment said what I have to say about it, and will, for my conclusion to these lectures, be moving on to two poems which didn't become available until papyrus and parchment fragments started surfacing. But I hope it will become clear how doing so continues the agenda I've been pursuing here from the start, which has been to come to an understanding of what it is, beyond the mere bullying of tradition, that has given her shredded corpus such a hold on us. I do have a proposal to make there, and a fairly specific one, though I think the way to make it is to talk about what seem to me two of Sappho's most powerful, if damaged, poems. The power and the damage are, the way things stand, beyond disentangling. Maybe make that 3 poems. That will require some explaining and a brief return to Sappho's early modern history, and the poem I mentioned in my first lecture, which provided me with my first direct encounter with classical Greek literature. That would be Sappho fragment 168b, widely referred to as the Midnight poem, though I prefer using the incipit Dedecuman. We have it because Hephaestion, the 2nd century AD scholar of Greek prosody, whose name came up several times in my last lecture, and who was responsible for the survival of a number of Sapphic fragments, decided to quote it to illustrate a particular variant of Ionic tetrameter. The scribe treated it as 2 long lines, but it is now universally presented as 4 short ones. So, Dedicemena Selana, kai Pleiades Messaide Nuptes Paraderchet Ora, Godemona Catado. There is no ready way to show this in English, but the penultimate word in Greek supplies a kind of closure by identifying the speaker as female. The moon is set, and this is my translation, the moon is set, and the Pleiades, it is midnight, and the hour passes, and I lie alone. There are numerous quotations nearby that Hephaestion identifies as being from Sappho, attributions now accepted. This is not one of them, though Hephaestion does not assign it to anyone else. It is not in Sappho's Aeolic dialect, though neither are Hephaestion's texts for passages he does identify as hers. The changes needed to bring it into line, however, are modest, all but inaudible to most modern ears, and many editors now make them. And I've given you both the received version from Hephaestion and then its aeolicized version. And unless you're fairly, conversant with classical Greek, you're going to have trouble seeing where the differences are. The lines would have appeared in print in the Editio Princeps of Hephaestion in 1526, but with no author named. The ascription to Sappho was apparently first made by a displaced Byzantine scholar named Arsenios Apostolis, lived from 1468-69 to 1535, annotating material that his father, Michael, had rescued from the fall of Constantinople. And Arsenios just writes out in the margin there, Sappho, and that's all. Henri Etienne preached Dedicemen with a text of Poikilothron in the 2nd edition of his Anacreon in 1554. I was looking at that edition just the other day in the Wren, making it half of the first collected Sappho of modern times. In Etienne's 1560 collection, it is grouped with the other Sappho quotations culled from Hephaestion, none of them aeolicized. Orsini, the editor of the other Sappho collection of the 16th century, Orsini gathers it, still without dialectal adjustment, with other quotations, which he suggests are from Sappho's Epithalamium. Now, in the canon, it eventually becomes one of the most widely disseminated, translated, and imitated of the Sapphic fragments, whether Sappho herself actually composed it or not. Aldous Huxley includes it in Aeolic Greek, in Texts and Pretexts, 1933, a polemically framed anthology of poetry and commentary, and this quote from the introduction there are more fish in the sea of literature than ever came out of it, at least in the nets of Palgrave, Quiller, Couch, and Bridges, unquote, addressed somewhat elusively to the anxiousness of the present moment. Of course, Hitler had just taken office in Germany. Huxley has no doubt that the poem is Sappho's, and singles out for praise the eloquence of its compression. Not even the Chinese could have said more in so small a compass. Night and desire, the anguish of waiting, and with it the duller, the deeper, the more hopelessly incurable pain of knowing that every light must set, that life and love are declining, inexorably westering towards the darkness. All these things are implied. How completely! Exclamation point in Sappho's lines. The citation of classic Chinese poetry is interesting, and I will be coming back to it. Huxley also seems to be thinking of Hausmann's three versions of the poem, each running to 8 lines. I'll quote the incipits: the half-moon westers low, the weeping Pleiades wester, the rainy Pleiades wester. Like Huxley's commentary, and I didn't quote all of it, they manifest the expansiveness that the Greek lines often inspire, on which I will have more to say momentarily. Huxley's presentation, poem plus commentary, is picked up by Huntington Cairns for his Bollingen anthology, The Limits of Art, 1948, an ambitious, almost 1,500-page gathering of passages of literature, quote, which have been pronounced perfect or the greatest of their kind, unquote. Cairns took the title from a poem by Parrhasius in the Greek anthology Technes Terma, The Limits of Art. As a would-be scientist who was puzzled and enticed by the way people talked about literature, especially poetry, I was in no way put off by the pretentiousness of this. I wanted to find out, as Thelma put it to Louise that morning in the coffee shop, what all the fuss was about. If memory serves, this is where, at an impressionable moment, I first came upon this particular bit of Greek and almost immediately, as they say, got it. Not everyone has. Wilamowitz, yes, he's back, 1886, thought the 4 lines constituted a charming folk song, Reisende Volkslied, and was willing to have them transposed into Aeolic, but also thought they implied a context at odds with his own preemptive commitment to Sappho's virtue. Quote, "This girl is waiting at her open chamber door for her boyfriend. Is this supposed to be Sappho?" Unquote. Touchiness about her sexuality, even without the shame of lesbianism, impressively disorders the legendary scholar's attentiveness to the text. The persona loquens is not waiting at an open door. What door? But lying down. Diskin Clay's reading, 1970, with updates in 2011, is, I think, the one most in key with the uncanny resonance the text has had for many readers. The setting of the moon is not just an astronomical phenomenon, but a mythological and sexually charged one. And quoting Clay, "The secret of the midnight poem is that Silana, the moon, man, there in the Greek, sinks into the seas to join Endymion. But midnight comes on, de. The season of love passes by, de. And the human woman and poet, ego de, must sleep alone," unquote. Not the least virtue of this interpretation is that it makes sense of the definite article in front of Silana, which would be odd in Aeolic unless the noun were a proper name. It is possible that the Pleiades, 2 of whom became wives of Poseidon in later texts, figure in the same way, though Clay does not push this. The clandestine love of the goddess for her mortal lover, being consummated unseen in the fabled Latmian cave, mocks the speaker's solitude and at the same time floods it with emotion. In the literary legacy of Deducman, an impassioned woman is embowered in an endlessly explored nighttime state where time passes and nothing happens. That scene fascinated the young Tennyson, whose lyric talents were well suited to evoking it, and many of you will recognize what I'm about to quote. "And ever when the moon was low and the shrill winds were up and away, in the white curtain to and fro she saw the gusty shadows sway. But when the moon was very low and wild winds bound within their cell, the shadow of the poplar fell upon her bed across her brow. She only said, 'The night is dreary. He cometh not,' she said. She said, 'I am aweary, aweary. I would that I were dead.'" And that, of course, is Mariana. 7 such stanzas exfoliate from a single Shakespearean suggestion. "At the moated grange resides this dejected Mariana," from Measure for Measure, condensed by Tennyson into an even briefer epigraph, Mariana in the Moated Grange. Over 96 hypnotically repetitious lines, all that changes is a slight stiffening of the refrain, and the final version of the refrain is, "Then she said, 'I am very dreary. He will not come,' she said. She wept, 'I am aweary, aweary. Oh God, that I were dead,'" unquote. Arthur Hallam commented at the time on Tennyson's interest in the Greek poets, especially, quote, and I'm quoting Hallam now, "the fragments of Sappho in which I see much congeniality to Alfred's peculiar power," unquote. Neither of the 2 friends was in a position to know at the time that the conclusion of Mariana, "I would that I were dead," might as well be quoting Sappho directly, fragment 94-1, first printed in 1907. Something over a century later, Elizabeth Bishop's Insomnia, 1951, begins slyly with a line mimicking the prosodic pattern, da-dum, da-da-dum, da-dum-dum, that attracted Hephaestion's attention back in the day and secured the Greek quotation's survival in the first place, "the moon in the bureau mirror." and moves from there into an exploration of the speaker's hapless envy of the heavenly power against whose self-satisfaction she cannot help measuring her own fate. The moon in the bureau mirror looks out 1,000,000 miles, and perhaps with pride at herself, but she never smiles, far and away beyond sleep, or perhaps she's a daytime sleeper. The moon seems to have it all figured out, and the speaker begins to think she might pull off the same trick. By the universe deserted, she'd tell it to go to hell, and she'd find a body of water or a mirror on which to dwell, so wrap up care in a cobweb and drop it down the well. But as the speaker follows through on her line of thought, it becomes clear that the beckoning world in which everything is the opposite of what it is here is, well, a trick done with mirrors. Into that world inverted where left is always right, where the shadows are really the body, where we stay awake all night. And that sets up the poem's devastating ending, the delayed acknowledgement of what this has all been about. Where the heavens are shallow as the sea is now deep, and you love me. What waits in the depths of the poem's lunar self-absorption is a happy ending that knows it is a delusion. Indeed, the happy ending, like many happy endings, but seldom with such open self-awareness, gets its impact precisely from knowing its own falsity. Hold that thought. Before I follow up on it, there are a couple other things to be dealt with. One is Huxley's reference to classic Chinese poetry as a standard of concentration by which Dedekimen can be measured. His reference is unspecific, but here is a well-known example which may very possibly have been on Huxley's mind. Nope, next one. There we go. The jewel steps are already quite white with dew. It is so late that the dew soaks my gauze stockings, and I let down the crystal curtain and watch the moon through the clear autumn. That is, in its entirety, the Jewel Stairs Grievance, printed in Ezra Pound's Cathay, 1915, as a translation of Rihaku, the Japanese name for the 8th century AD poet Li Po, more accurately now known as Li Bai. Cathay is the volume that prompted T.S. Eliot to call Pound the inventor of Chinese poetry for our time. The Jewel Stairs Grievance is the only poem in it accompanied by commentary, and here is the commentary. Jewel Stairs, therefore a palace. Grievance, therefore there is something to complain of. Gauze stockings, therefore a court lady, not a servant who complains. Clear autumn, therefore he has no excuse on account of weather. Hail isn't falling. Also, she has come early, for the dew has not merely whitened the stairs, but has soaked her stockings. The poem is especially prized because she utters no direct reproach, unquote. That concluding critical judgment, by the way, did not originate with Pound, but can be traced back to the Yuan dynasty. This economical note I also came upon at a vulnerable moment in my literary education, and with some meditation, I took it to heart. Not as a guide to getting at the poem's real meaning, but as a demonstration of how heightened attentiveness and imagination can work together for a bracingly economical approach to both writing and reading. That's something like what in our profession we call close reading, though I've never been quite satisfied with that phrase. What Pound was after was not pinning down a critical methodology, but mounting an inclusive reform of English poetry and prose, while he was at it, against what seemed to him the indulgent sloppiness that had come to dominate. Just say it in as few words as possible and learn to expect that kind of concision in what you read. In this reform, classical Chinese poetry, at least as he could perceive it through the resources available to him, and the Jewel Stairs Grievance is, in fact, fairly straightforward as a translation. There's very little in that he could be said to have gotten wrong, provided one important model. Another, at about the same time, was archaic Greek poetry, as was most notoriously evident in the poem in Lystra entitled Papyrus, Spring, ... Too long, ... Gongula, ... The poem called forth some rowdy and now obsolete mockery from Robert Graves and Laura Riding, 1927, in their attack on the nonsense going around in those days under the name of modernism. And that's now quoting Graves and Riding. Who or what is gongula? Is it the name of a person, of a town, of a musical instrument? Or is it the obsolete botanical word meaning spores? Or is it a mistake for Gongora, the Spanish poet from whom the word gongorism is formed, meaning an affected elegance of style, also called cultism? And why papyrus? Unquote. Well, yes, papyrus is technically incorrect. Pound's source text is an important parchment discovery, a more expensive and durable material than papyrus. Whoever wrote this down wanted it to last and was willing to spend some money to make that happen. First edited for publication in 1902. And I quoted from it, in fact, in my second lecture. Pound is translating from Sappho, though he does not say as much. The parchment text is in bad shape, and scholars have been working on it since its discovery. Here is more or less how the lines in question now appear in Nery's edition, and that's the little dollop of Greek there below Pound's thing. Most translators simply skip the first two of those lines, not to mention a preceding line that contains all of one legible letter. Pound, as usual, not fussing the syntax, took er to have something to do with er. You heard the difference in the pronunciation. Er, a poeticism for er, spring, and derat to have something to do with deros, too long, realizing that if you follow them with a female proper name, which on the evidence of other evidence, gongola definitely is, you have what we now, modernism having indeed done its work, have no trouble recognizing as a poem. One whose emotional impact doesn't need the connective syntax and is indeed the stronger without it. That impact, both in concision and content, can be set beside that of Deducament. In both cases, of course, the impact may be a kind of accident. The manuscript gaps that in papyrus Pound incorporates into his translation heighten the sense of loss and poignance on which the modern poem relies. For all we know, though, the vanished original may have filled them in a very different way and to very different effect. And the first two lines may have had nothing to do with spring, or the passage of time, or physical distance. Deducament does not have the same kind of internal lacunae, but cogent arguments have been made in 1993 by Paula Reiner and David Kovacs that it deserves serious emendation, and to my knowledge, they have not been decisively refuted, though Nery does not cite them in his ambitious edition. And of course, the aesthetic effectiveness of the text as it stands, obviously a subjective judgment, does not in itself make the case that what we have was originally a complete poem. The damage inflicted by its textual transmission, routed through the bean counting of a prosody-obsessed pedant, may simply have edited it down to what will pass for a poem. Reiner and Kovacs, citing parallels in Theocritus and Horace, and as it happens, thinking that the lines probably are by Sappho, speculate among other possibilities that the speaker in Deducament might have originally been the target of a vindictively satirical poem in which the poet enjoys imagining this poor woman's loneliness, and quoting, this is Reiner and Kovacs saying what might have been the original. There is no way to rule out the possibility that our poem continued, quote, so spoke Attis, once beloved by me, but loved no more after she has run with that treacherous Andromeda, unquote. You're sleeping all alone. There's no way, absent a major papyrus discovery, of seriously arguing for such a possibility either. But it is sufficiently consistent with the glimpses we have of the original environment of Sappho's poems that we indeed can't rule it out. I've tried to be careful not to refer to Deducament as a poem rather than an excerpt, though that caution only goes so far. There are plenty of four-line classical Greek poems and lyric meters that we are reasonably confident are complete, many of them in the charming folk song category, though none of them is as memorable as Deducament or as anything like its literary afterlife. What is nevertheless certain is that the four-line result of what history may have done to this text in its blundering obtuseness is now a poem, complete as far as we're concerned, and one which has had and will continue to have appreciative readers and imitators. Professional literary criticism doesn't quite know what to do with a situation like this, though I find I don't really regard that as a problem, or at least not an interesting one. In any case, and I said something like this in my first lecture, if the ignorant accidents of history present us with something that can pass for a complete poem, especially what has turned out to be an unforgettable one, why decline the gift? The scattered but significant role of Sappho in Pound's poetry in the teens has been brilliantly tracked by Hugh Kenner, on whom I'm relying here. One outcome of this was Pound's vigorous encouragement of Mary Barnard, a young woman in Vancouver, Washington, daughter of a guy in the lumber business, who looked up his address in the library and just wrote him out of the blue, to produce what eventually became an important new translation of 100 of the available fragments. Finished in 1953, published in 1958, it is still in print. I saw a copy over in Heffer's while I was here. Still in print with the original publisher. Pound's letters to her over a period of 20 years are heavy in their emphasis on rhythm and syllabic quantity. Get a metronome and learn how long the different syllables and groups of them take, unquote, with repeated calls that she practiced writing Sapphics and not persistently using a spondy like that blighter Horace for the second foot. Though it is by no means clear how those instructions show up in the resulting translation, which does not employ classical meters as such. What does seem to show up is an injunction towards, quote, abruptness, unquote. What is the maximum abruptness you can get to? Manifested most obviously in one of Barnard's stylistic signatures, her persistent use of enjambment, there at the bottom. And she gives all of the translations titles, by the way. This one, awed by her splendor. Stars near the lovely moon cover their own bright faces when she is roundest and lights earth with her silver. Translating fragment 34. The spareness of this was a breath of fresh air, even a revelation. And Barnard set the course for Sappho translations in a way that still holds, and for quite good reasons is not likely to change. But the texture of minute interruptions, which Barnard uses to shape her lines, and here she typographically inserts one into the middle of a line, the bright faces when she, involves a repeated, typographically inserts one into the middle line, involves a repeated use of a move Sappho's Greek doesn't very often make. Sappho's text, as now printed, does display some sharp enjambments, but many are a kind of optical illusion happening between the third and fourth lines of a Sapphic stanza, as indeed the case with fragment 34, which it appears antiquity regarded as a single uninterrupted line in a three-line stanza. And you will often see there in the third line of a Sapphic stanza as a print over text a dash, as if she's breaking the word over the end of the line. They probably didn't see it that way, and almost certainly did not see it that way in antiquity. And the testimony from antiquity is that what distinguished Sappho's poetry for her first millennium of auditors and readers was not the delicate textual hesitancies and fissures that satisfy a modern readership, but a style that, quote, always chooses the smoothest and softest of words, hunting for euphony and melodiousness and the sweetness that is derived from them, unquote, and judges, end quote, judges what juxtapositions will be able to make the sounds more musical and examines by what arrangements the words will produce the more attractive combinations, and so it tries to fit each word together, taking great pains to have everything planed and rubbed down smooth and all joints neatly dovetailed, unquote. So Dionysius of Halicarnassus, writing about 700 years after Sappho, but a lot closer chronologically and culturally to her than we can ever be. We would need a lot more information than we have or will ever have to know how good a judge of literary style Dionysius was. But the elegantly smooth poet he describes is sufficiently different from the one who seems credible in modern English to, well, give us something to think about. Not that there is any going back. The catalog of unmemorable attempts to translate Sappho's remains into the florid and wordy manner of English lyric poetry of the 18th and 19th centuries is not going to make us nostalgic for the effort. But there's more going on here, something uncanny. For Sappho's texts, as we have them, definitely do have fissures running through them. It's just that she didn't put them there herself. They are the fissures that history cut in them, and in papyrus, Pound openly incorporates them into his poem to galvanic effect. Barnard, for the most part, never quite saw them. By her own account, she was working with the Loeb text of J.M. Edmonds, 1922, a highly qualified scholar, but one whose confidence filling in the gaps in the Greek was, well, excessive. Many of his emendations have since disappeared. Subsequent editors, including Campbell in the Loeb edition that has replaced Edmonds, have deferred to the austere caution shown by Lobel and Page in their Poetarum Lesbiorum Fragmenta, 1955. And it has become commonplace for translators to follow their example. Here is Guy Davenport, translating from Fragment 94, Fragment 94. Skip down to the last three stanzas. Wait a minute. Yes. The garlands I plaited of flower with flower around your graceful neck, the oils of spices as precious as for a queen, gap, more gap. New stanza. Deep in the cushions on that softest bed, where free and desired gap, gap. Tender lovers, gap. None, gap. Holy and no, gap. There was that we were apart from, gap. No sacred grove, gap. The square brackets and empty spaces mimic the ways in which scholarly texts strive to represent the condition of a damaged original as accurately as possible, with the gaps measured to correspond at least roughly to the number of letters that the lost words could have contained. There are also conventional symbols, which I'm not using here, for indicating which readings of individual letters are less than certain. This information would, among other things, be important to other scholars thinking about possible supplements. We have become used to seeing Sappho translations looking like this. Sometimes, as here, with square brackets, as Ann Carson and Jim Powell do it, sometimes with 3 dots, as Diane Rayor does it, to indicate empty spaces. When applied to the English text, though, the apparent scrupulousness can't have the same rigor and also doesn't really serve the same purpose as they do in the Greek text. Davenport indicates no gaps in his version of the first part of the fragment, though there are some in the Greek. Before my lying heart could speak for life, I'm going back to the beginning of the poem. Before my lying heart could speak for life, I longed for death. Misery the size of terror was in her tears when we unclasped forever. Sappho, she cried, that I could stay. Joy goes with you, I said. Remember what has been, the rose and violet crowns. I rove into your hair, and we stood so close together, heart against heart. Okay. Here's the Greek text. Davenport has quietly filled in a serious lacuna. And in the first part, we see the Greek text, the gaps are preponderantly in the last part of the poem, but they're also there in the first part. But Davenport foregrounds the later ones and eliminates the first. Davenport quietly filled in a serious lacuna right there at the beginning, in fact, as you see, covering his tracks with a shift in typographical format. The Greek text begins with the outburst I quoted in my second lecture, Tetnakein dadolos dalo, I honestly want to die, and that's up there, but without making explicit which of the poem's 2 characters says it. Is it the woman who's leaving or the woman who is talking to the woman who's leaving? That's a powerful incipit. It's a great way to begin a poem, but not the poem's original opening. What survives probably begins with line 2. And the lost preceding line, or maybe a further stanzas, presumably made clear whether the cry of despair comes from the poem's speaker, whom in this case we soon find out is named Sappho, or from the woman who is leaving, whose name never comes up in the surviving text. In one case, that woman's suicidal outcry is what prompts the attempted consolation that follows. In the other, Sappho's own misery is from the start just as great as her lover's, and infects and seriously compromises the confidence in her attempt to lift the woman's spirits. Davenport unambiguously opts for the latter, in what is indeed, I think, the stronger reading. The straightforward thing would have been to begin with an entire blank line within square brackets, but Davenport does something different. Switching the tercets of the Greek for four-line stanzas, as you notice, these are not Sapphic stanzas, but Davenport represents them as if they were. Switching the tercets of the Greek for a four-line stanza with a fourth line conspicuously shorter than the others, that's how you know this is, as it were, a version of a Sapphic stanza. Davenport mimics the layout of the Sapphic stanza, the form most associated with Sappho, and by presenting the first of those stanzas as textually intact, as he does here, he avoids any sign that anything is missing from the start of the poem. The rationale for this appears to be, and I'm guessing Davenport does not, to my knowledge, comment on this his strategy here, to limit the bracketed gaps to the latter part of the poem, where they trouble Sappho's soothing appeal to the memory of the time she and her lover have had together. The translation's first two stanzas isolate the fourth line to serve, as it often does, in the Sapphic stanza for special emphasis. And just to go back, Sappho, she cried, and then heart against heart, there in the short emphasized fourth line. Then in the next three stanzas, there are only blanks. The last line of each stanza is a blank. We go from Sappho, she cried heart against heart, and then blank, blank, blank. Only blanks at this point in the stanza, measuring the intimacy that has disappeared. The poem, as Davenport presents it, is in an emotional arc in which intense feeling gradually loses its way. An anguished memory of leave-taking scatters the remains of a love now lost even as it reaches out for them. Held back until the end of the third stanza, the bracketed gaps mark a drift away from the beloved to the places and occasions that the two women shared. Those memories themselves are in turn summoned by repeated negations, none, no, no, that ultimately engulfed the sights of that vanished happiness. The strain of the remembered attempt to comfort the woman who is leaving takes its toll on the speaker, and her increasingly precarious ability to continue finally fails and goes silent. The speaker in the undamaged original would have been articulate to the end. That is just how it is with classical poetry. Within the categories of classical literary theory, the poem, the full original poem, would probably be an example in verse of the propempticon, the send-off speech, a species of epidictic rhetoric specially marked, according to Menander Rhetor, our main authority, by habrotes and charis, elegance and charm, terms regularly associated with Sappho's poetry. Its task is like that of an invocation, but inverted. Rather than summoning and welcoming some powerful and admired presence, it offers compensatory praise on the occasion of a regretted farewell. The praise lingers as a presence even as its object is gone. We don't know enough about the genre's history to say exactly what conventions Sappho would have been observing or defying in Lesbos in the 7th century BC, and Menander was writing a millennium later. But the general expectation would have been upbeat. If well done, the consolation would succeed. And in that regard, Davenport dramatically, if unavoidably, breaks faith with the original Greek text. By the end, it is clear that his handling of the poem's opening is an announcement that the consolation will fail. The uncanny thing is, of course, that in a comparably dramatic way, this failure does not break faith with the original. It fits. The damage done to the Greek text puns, if you will, on the content and occasion of the original poem, the experience of irretrievable loss that cannot be alleviated through language. Whether the poem as Sappho actually finished it was a better poem than what we have now is, as far as I'm concerned, a meaningless question. But I would affirm that the poem we have, precisely in the form in which we have it, as a kind of classic modern hybrid, is one of Sappho's most effective, edited for us by history. The situation is similar to that of Dedekimen, and I would repeat the question I asked there: why decline the gift? Feminist critics have taken something more hopeful from Fragment 94. In the open-ended reverie of shared memories, pleasures, and places, has been seen a zone where the bitter constraints of the situation dissolve into a trance within which rules might be changed. And now quoting Melissa Mueller, feelings of sadness and desiring despair give way to a more dispersed kind of animacy, one in which, partly due to the fragmentary state of the parchment, it is no longer possible to say who or what is satisfying whom, unquote. This dreamlike state has affinities with the collective coma. That's a Greek word, but also it's a source of coma. The eerily suggestive term used in the Greek for which the speaker in Fragment 2, the text that was written on that pottery shard, prays to Aphrodite on behalf of her company. Its blessed confusion, quoting now Ellen Green, intimates an erotic practice and discourse outside of patriarchal modes of thought, one that constructs erotic experience outside male assumptions about dominance and submission, unquote. The state of the text does provide the leeway for taking it like that, though the result is obviously its own kind of classic modern hybrid, and I think a more vulnerable one. The last poem I want to talk about, Fragment 16, which hasn't acquired a widely used nickname, doesn't offer the same kind of opportunity. The text is indeed damaged, but we have it in what seems very close to a complete form, 5 Sapphic stanzas with the beginning and the ending in, for Sappho, reasonably good shape, and the sense of the middle not beyond reasonable guessing. The papyrus, first edited by Edmonds in 1914, supplies fragments from 3 further stanzas, but many scholars take those to belong to another poem, and I think the reasons for doing so are sound. Aside from some serious static in stanzas 3 and 4, the poem, I take it, is basically intact. It also resonates with Fragment 94 to enhance a sense, I'm hardly the only one to feel it, that the most distinctive thing about Sappho as a love poet is how she is drawn to scenes of abandonment. Though, with what I would argue is artful indirection, you wouldn't easily guess it from the way the poem starts. There we go. Some say a host of cavalry, others of infantry, and others of ships is the most beautiful thing on the black earth. But I say it is whatsoever a person loves. The stanza has become the classic example of what is known as a preeminent, not a classical term, by the way. Its presentation here has an intellectual air, as of a question proposed at some kind of symposium, with or without wine. That air continues as the speaker offers to provide proof of her argument, but as that proof unfolds, the sequence of thought becomes unexpectedly hard to follow. It is perfectly easy to make this understood by everyone, for she who far surpassed mankind in beauty, Helen, left her most noble husband and went sailing off to Troy with no thought at all for her child or dear parents, but gap took her away. The gap was presumably love or some term for it, but the argument seems to be drifting. The person whom Helen found the most beautiful thing in the world, though everybody knows who he was, never quite shows up in the poem. It is Helen herself whose beauty is insisted upon, and the action on which the poet dwells is not her union with the apparently unnamed Paris, but her desertion of her husband, as well as of her daughter and parents. Critics have spent a good deal of time worrying the question of how Helen was judged in archaic Greek culture, but that is to get diverted, I think, from what is happening in the poem. The irresistible first stanza has us thinking that the poem will celebrate a life lived for love. And the expectation that the speaker, let's call her Sappho, means to claim that role for herself stays with us to increasingly confusing effect until, well, until we find out we've got it exactly upside down. The first half of the fourth stanza is the most troubled patch in the text, but when the clouds part, we suddenly realize what is going on. For gap, thought, gap, lightly, gap, think, gap, has reminded me now of Anactoria, who is not here. Sappho identifies not with Helen, but with Menelaus, the one who has been deserted. Everything changes with that acknowledgement, and critics have a way of tying themselves in knots by not stopping to take it in. Anne Carson describes the poem as, quote, restless and strangely baited, one that seems to gather its logic into itself rather than pay it out, unquote. Though I think the emotional logic of what is going on, once you get it into focus, is straightforward. The occasion, the fictional occasion to be sure, but that is the one that counts, is not some philosophic discussion of the nature of beauty, but the return of the memory of someone now gone. The memory we sense has been there all along, but deferred, too painful to face. The pain of it nevertheless surfaces with the speaking of Anactoria's name, and in a brilliant prosodic coup is captured in the Adonic of the fourth stanza, that shorter line at the end of the stanza, which mimics the gravity at the end of an epic hexameter, dump-diddy-dump-dump. Every Sapphic stanza ends the way a line of dactylic hexameter ends. And in this case, Anactoria, who is not here, ou pareoisas, dump-diddy-dump-dump, who is not here. The faint and intellectual debate and the detour into a mythic parallel that isn't quite right have just been tactical delays in facing up to what is now out in the open. She is not here. The result could have been devastating. It is not. I would rather see her lovely walk and the bright sparkle of her face than the Lydians' chariots and armed infantry. The memory is lively and specific and returns the poem to the opposition of its opening stanza, though in reverse order. And instead of the abstractness of whatever a person loves, with no gender specified even in the Greek, we have a woman with a name, identified by Maximus of Tyre and the Suda as being in Sappho's circle. Swinburne, who did not know this text, makes Anactoria the great love of Sappho's life. She is also a woman with a unique and uniquely beloved way of walking and of looking at the world around her. And she is set against not a generalized reference to martial force, but a now particular one to the wealthy and sometimes menacing Asiatic neighbor just across the strait on the mainland, its name a byword for orientalizing high fashion and high military might, and known for its war chariots. Infantry, peston, has become armed infantry, pestomagentas. The first half of that latter word, as you can see there, see the bracket there in the last line. The first half of that latter word is one of Edmund's emendations, credited to one Mr. Rackham, presumably Harris Rackham, but one that has stuck, supplying another impressive Adonic for probably the end of the poem, with perhaps an onomatopoetic rumble of troops on the march. Pestomagentas. Contemporary critics have understandably been eager to see the opposition Sappho sets up as one of love against war, of the feminine against the masculine, of individual passion against militant collectivity. Something of that, certainly. But as Robert Bagg puts it, Sappho, quote, didn't bring Helen and chariots and black earth into the poem merely to triumph over them. Rather, the world of war, quote, charges the poem's atmosphere with military splendor and power, which the beloved seems to absorb in conquering these troops. And a more accurate translation of Kaliston than beautiful would be thrilling or sensational, unquote. The spectacle figures most importantly in the poem's conclusion. The hymn to Aphrodite, which the Alexandrian and most modern editions of Sappho's, the Alexandrian and most modern editions of Sappho's poetry begin, ends with a confident, even presumptuous martial flourish. Sumachos eso, be my partner in battle. That is where the power is when this poet needs it. Put it this way. At the end of fragment 16, the now vivid memory of Anactoria energizes her bereft lover, and loss can be a source of strength. The poem is a heroic and at least momentarily triumphant compliment to the ravaged fragment 94. It's not quite all there is to it. The reason the Menelaus-Sappho parallel takes a while to register is that it is inexact in an important way. As Helen's husband, the former had a public legal claim on Helen, backed up, as it happens, by formidable and ultimately successful armed forces, beyond anything like what the latter could have had on Anactoria. In the grim shadow of this contrast, Sappho does not, as far as we can tell, make any appeal to decay, justice, like the one she does in Poikilothron. I think Helen's presence in her thoughts tells against it. Anactoria's departure was a far less transgressive and consequential act than Helen's. Its consequence in this poem limited to its emotional impact on the speaker. It is probably fair to say that the poem itself, through the metaphorical deployment of its martial references, draws from the situation what victory the speaker can obtain. It makes her, for the moment, feel better. In my first lecture, I voiced my hesitation to tangle with the more ambitious reconstructions of the context of Sappho's love poems. I still hesitate, but the way abandonment stands out as a theme in her work, and I don't mean quantitatively, but in terms of emotional force and memorability, is something specific to her and not in the same way to other major love poets, except perhaps for Catullus, but he's obviously a special case because he was in love with her, does seem to me related to an environment in which abandonment is something like the norm. Gone again, same old story, going to come to an end. That is always the risk, of course, with erotic passion, and that is one reason Sappho's poetry of desire has provoked the wide response it has. But I think the poems themselves owe something, perhaps a lot, to the asymmetry visible in the central twist of fragment 16. Erotic passion between two women could not aspire to the same authorization and permanence as that between a man and a woman. In a papyrus scrap first published in 1951, there is a tantalizing reference, without context, to one Archeanassa as Gorgos Syndigos, or Sudzuk's partner or something like that, maybe even wife. Women with those names are mentioned elsewhere in the Sapphic fragments. Was Sappho's circle evolving or trying to evolve some semi-official term for a durable erotic bond between two women? But there's no real evidence that such an effort, if indeed that's what it was, went any farther than this. And syndigos may, for all we know, have been deployed in a satiric and mocking way. There's a lot of mockery in archaic Greek poetry. Its flickering presence doesn't affect the picture of it being easier and more likely for Anactoria to leave Sappho than for Helen to leave Menelaus. That it may even have been expected because of some arrangement whereby young women regularly left whatever tutelage or mentoring Sappho provided in order to enter into what is now called heteronormative marriage with a suitable, possibly Lydian husband, is, I agree, not beyond conjecture. Though we will never know that with any kind of certainty, and we don't need it to feel the force of the poetry. What we do know is the experience of being left, on the face of it, the repeated experience of being left is one that Sappho understood in a deep way and sang about with an intensity we still find haunting.